Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am curator Kevin Adkison with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today I have boldly crossed the street, Lone Pine Road, to bring you all to one of the most magnificent churches in this country, Christ Church Cranbrook. And Christ Church Cranbrook really is the origin story of the Cranbrook educational community. And although it is no longer technically legally part of Cranbrook educational community, it was spun off in 1973 for tax reasons, it is really where each of the Cranbrook institutions can trace their roots. Christ Church Cranbrook was a gift given by George and Ellen Scripps Booth to the people of Bloomfield Hills and to the future of this community. Now, we at Cranbrook at the center don't often talk about George Booth as an Episcopalian and as a devoutly religious man, but he truly was, and he led a life of Christian stewardship. And really all of the Cranbrook institutions not only trace their story back to Christ Church Cranbrook, but they really trace their roots back to George and Ellen's deeply held Christian beliefs. Now, this church was consecrated on September 29th, 1928, but it was not the first church to be given to a community. Both Ellen's father had started a church. He started Trinity Episcopal Church in downtown Detroit in 1893. And George's father, Henry Wood Booth, had started two churches in Toronto and in St. Thomas, Ontario in the 1870s. Religious services started at Cranbrook on May 15th, 1904, when the very first Sunday school lessons on the property were taught actually on the corner right across the street from where this church would eventually be built. From there, the church grew from Sunday school lessons taught by Henry Wood Booth, George's father, into lessons taught by reverends from the community. In the 1920s, about 1923, George decided that he would build a permanent edifice, a permanent church. He looked at a number of different sites on which to build his church, including at Lone Pine Road and Woodward Avenue to be closer to the trolley line. He looked at building it on the other side of Lone Pine Road, and he even looked at building it where Kingswood is. But he always kept coming back to this corner. And it did take between 1924 and 1928 for the church to be constructed here by the architect Oscar Murray. And Oscar Murray was the lead designer of Bertram Goodhue and Associates. Bertram Goodhue is one of my favorite architects. He's one of America's most important architects. But Mr. Goodhue had been contacted to design the church in early 1924, and about a week after he met with George Booth, he passed away. And so the church ends up being designed by his lead assistant, Oscar Murray. Booth also corresponded with Ralph Adams Cram to ask if Cram, who had done the big Episcopal church in Detroit, if he was interested in doing the project. Cram ended up saying no, give it to Bertram Goodhue and Associates. Now, in November of 1924, the blueprints were completed for a church that was going to cost in 1924 about $550,000, close to $8.5 million today. In the end, it would not take George Booth, as he estimated, just 2 years to build the church, but it would take another 5 years to come to fruition and about $18 million. And all of this was a gift to both the Episcopal Diocese and to the community. So we are going to first thank our host today, Christ Church Cranbrook, and Father Bill Donaher, for allowing us to come into the church and to tour the art and architecture. The history of the church is long and complex, and we'll talk about much of it on today's, or parts of it on today's Live at 5. But I'm really going to be focusing on what we do so well at the Center for Collections and Research, which is the story of the art and architecture. Now, on the day that this edifice, this multi-million-dollar gift to the people of Bloomfield Hills was dedicated, it started with quite a procession. And so the procession began across Lone Pine Road at St. Dunstan's, and it was led first by a cross, then an American flag, the newly formed Christ Church Cranbrook Choir, other Episcopal choirs, the bishop, then the rector, the vestrymen, members, friends, and neighbors. And they processed from St. Dunstan's into the front door of church. And they processed along to the hymn, "Christ has Made the Sure Foundation" by Henry Purcell. Well, that was a very exciting way to begin our tour here of Christ Church Cranbrook. And I want to thank the organist and director of music, Christopher Wells, for coming out on a Wednesday afternoon and playing that hymn, the Westminster Abbey hymn by Henry Purcell, "Christ has Made the Sure Foundation." And Christopher said he doesn't want to be on the Live at 5, so he'll escape while we continue our tour. Now, if you have come to an event at Christ Church Cranbrook, you do know that this church is absolutely chock-a-block full of art and architecture in this sort of wonderful medieval fantasy, this Gothic revival style. And it wasn't just a style that was arbitrarily chosen. When George Booth and Oscar Murray were riding back and forth from the New York office to Bloomfield Hills, George Booth told Murray about his own ancestry back to England, to Kent, and to the little church, St. Dunstan's Church in Kent, an Anglican church. He talked about watching his father-in-law build Trinity Episcopal, which is in the style of a 13th century English Anglican church. And he said that he wanted a little Anglican church. And I think you can see behind me that what he got was something much more than a little Anglican church. And for that, for the transformation from the idea of building a private family chapel on the estate into building this magnificent really a cathedral-esque Episcopalian church, we're indebted to the guidance and service of Reverend Samuel Marquis. And Reverend Marquis was from Ohio. He was told as a child that he was a very homely boy, and so the only profession for him was to be a minister. And he came from a long line of ministers. He kept getting kicked out of Episcopal College because he would have theological questions. And finally, one of his professors said, "If you have so many questions about God, go to the library." And Marquis really became quite a scholar of Christian theology as well as of the Episcopal denomination, the Anglican Communion. Now, Dr. Marquis had already held a number of important positions in church leadership in Metro Detroit, including being head of the main church in Detroit. And so he had built that building of 1905 by Ralph Adams Cram, St. Paul's, in downtown Detroit. When he then went on to lead the sociology department of Henry Ford, what created the $5 a day program. And Dr. Marquis was with Ford for about 5 years before they had a falling out. And that's when George Booth sort of sweeps in and says, I want to build this little church in the countryside. Won't you come and help me? And we really have to thank Marquis for being the leader, for being the inspiring force behind not only this church, but as George Booth would say things like, I want a choir school. Dr. Marquis, Father Marquis would say, why don't you build a preparatory school? And so Marquis is really involved in all the Cranbrook institutions, but he's especially dedicated to the construction of Christ Church Cranbrook. Now, we will begin our guided portion of the tour looking here in the narthex. And this space is the very front of the church. And we will get started by looking at the paschal candlestick. This is from the Capella Palatina in Palermo, Sicily. And the paschal candle, which is up at the top, is lit each Easter and kept lit for 40 days until the day of the Ascension. But this candlestick is probably even more impressive than the candle itself, which changes every year. This is a copy of the original Norman candlestick from the 12th century, and it's a mixture of Byzantine, Norman, and Fatimid architectural styles. And it shows the sort of tricultural state of Sicily in the 12th century, where you have Muslim designs, you have Christian, you have Eastern and Western designs all coming together. It's the same group, it's the same church where the fountain in the center of the Cranbrook School for Boys quadrangle is located. And it's also the same company that reproduced the fountain from the cloister at Palermo, redid the candlestick from Palermo, the Curazzi foundry in Naples. So they carved this in marble. And I love around the base, I don't love it, but I find intriguing the iconography of the lions who are eating the early Christians. So I'm not an expert on 12th century Norman art. I'll let someone else figure out why exactly we're showing that. But it is a sort of fascinating glimpse at George Booth's love of history and the commissioning of special works of art, reproducing historic works of art. Now, we're going to next head up to the women's window. This balcony features the four apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all with radiant angel wings. And one of the cool things about a Live at 5 tour is that we can go a little bit behind the scenes. And so I've asked the sexton to unlock the door, and we'll wind our way up to where we can get a better glimpse of two monumental tapestries. These tapestries were designed by J.H. Durrell of the Morris and Company. That's William Morris's textile division, and they were woven at Merton Abbey. Now, this tapestry is 12 feet wide by 22 feet tall. It's the tallest ever woven in one piece to that date. And on the northern wall, what I'm showing you now, is the new dispensation, or the rule of love. And it starts with stories from the New Testament, the Good Samaritan, Lazarus, Sermon on the Mount, the Nativity, the baptism of John. You can see the Nativity here in the lower center panel. And then across the bottom that says, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God," from Matthew 5:8 in the Latin. Now, in order to weave these tapestries, George Booth visited the Merton Abbey weavers, Morris and Company, and they said, it's 1925, we're about to go under. The arts and crafts movement has been going for a long time, but it can't go forever, and we are going to close the weaving workshop. And George Booth said, well, don't do that. Wouldn't you rather that I buy all the looms and then all of you immigrate and work for me at Christ Church Cranbrook weaving? In the end, they said, no thanks to the immigration, but they did decide to keep the weavers open. And it was actually George Booth who extended the Morris and Company Merton Abbey weavers for another decade, because it would take until the mid-1930s for both the new and old dispensation to arrive here at Cranbrook. Now, from this balcony, we get a pretty magnificent view over all of the church. And it also allows us to take a better look at the old dispensation, or the rule of law. And the Old Testament tapestry starts with Adam and Eve up at the top left, and then it goes through Abraham and Isaac, Solomon and David planning the temple, and other stories from the the Old Testament. And all of these are woven in that iconic William Morris and Company style, where it really begins to look almost like stained glass, these dark colors leading to these very beautiful blues and greens, all natural dyes. And you can see how a lot of times the Merton Abbey weavers, especially, William Morris dies in the 1890s, so he's not involved in this design. It's his associate, J.H. Durrell. You can see how they would sort of interchangeably do weavings out of stained glass designs and stained glass designs out of weavings. Now, the flag that is blocking our way from the old dispensation is also important here to the story of the church. These were a gift from Henry Scripps Booth and Carolyn Farr Booth, the son and daughter-in-law of George and Ellen. And the white flag features a beautiful gold cross on white silk. And this flag was used at the laying of the cornerstone and then at the procession of the church. And originally, the American flag was on this side, and it was a matching pair of flags. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the women's window, which is right behind me. This is a design that was produced by the White Friars in London, and the best view that we're going to have from it is not going to be at Alive at 5. And I encourage you to check out my colleague's blog. Laura McNewman wrote a wonderful blog detailing the story of the women's window, as well as guiding us through all of the figures. These are all Christian women who are important in the story of the world kind. And it was produced in London by the White Friars. And the reason I wanted to skip up here was to show you that there is, in fact, a White Friar on the window. If you can see over right there, there's a little White Friar. And that is because this stained glass factory or stained glass operation was established in the 1680s at White Friars. And so this was made in London 400 years into the company's history. And it features artists, actresses, monarchs, suffragettes. It features really just a who's who of characters from biblical times up to the 20th century. And so I believe that we're standing in front of Harriet Beecher Stowe here, Joan of Arc, and then over here we see Queen Elizabeth, Queen Isabella, and Queen Victoria. And if I aired on any of these names, again, I encourage you to check out the complete guide to the women's window, which is over on the Cranbrook Kitchen Sink blog. And if you look here, you'll see the American Impressionist Mary Cassatt, the great painter with her painter's palette. Now, I want to head back down so we can continue our tour. And as I navigate this tiny little stairway, I want to encourage all of you to, Live at 5 is a great introduction to the church. But do come back to the church. They obviously have services that all are welcome to attend. But they also do really wonderful guided tours led by the church members and volunteer docents. And so I am not the curator of the church. I am grateful that they've allowed me to come to the church today. But I encourage everyone to, when they resume again, come back and take one of the tours in person with the docents. And they'll be able to show you all of these handmade works of art in person. Now, all of the beautiful woodwork in the church, except for certain pieces, was made by the woodworking firm of Irving and Casson. It was part of the A.H. Davenport Company of Boston, and they worked on everything from cathedral altars to bedrooms, from the White House to suburban houses. They did all of the woodwork and furniture for the Frick Mansion, the Woolworth Mansion, the Vanderbilts, the Eastman Mansion in New York. And the partnership of the carpenters, Charles Irving and Robert Casson, had started really quite a long time ago in 1874, and Irving had passed away by the time this woodwork was done. Robert Casson would continue working, but it was quite an operation in Boston, and so that one firm out of Massachusetts did most of the woodwork. And all of this beautiful leaded glasswork is by G. Owen Bonawit, who, a lot like Irving and Casson, was sort of one of these mega designers. And so Irving and Casson did dozens of churches, and G. Owen Bonawit did hundreds of churches and hundreds of schools and universities. And so this is all leading, and you'll see that it gets its decorative designs not from stained glass. There's actually very little stained glass in the church, but it's getting its interest from the leading, from the caming. So the actual holder of the glass is the decorative design. The glass itself is very simple, very transparent. And then that beautiful woodwork from the studio of Irving and Casson. Next, we'll turn our attention to the baptistry. This was the first sacramental site dedicated by the bishop in the rites of consecration back in 1928. And it's in the traditional location here in the first steps of the church, because as the Christian pilgrim moves to the altar, they're going to need to be baptized. And we see here the wooden screen depicting the Lamb of God. John the Baptist said that Christ, or said, "Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sins of the world." And so we'll see different depictions of that scripture throughout the church. Now, in the baptistry itself, it features 3 stained glass windows. These are all done by the Scottish-American stained glass artist J. Gordon Guthrie. And he was a stained glass designer who really worked throughout New York, the New York area, as well as the Midwest, including time in the early 20th century with Tiffany. And so these are not Tiffany windows, but they are from a designer who was heavily associated with Tiffany from about 1900 to 1915. And we're in the baptistry, and so you can see here Christ being baptized in the River Jordan by John the Baptist. And the other windows reflect the story of John the Baptist, again from J. Gordon Guthrie. Now, the other window is part of a collection of antiques that are throughout the church. And so this is actually a window from Amiens, France, from the 13th century. And it shows on the lower frame Christ in the temple, and then the upper frame are the 3 Marys at the tomb of Christ. And so this actually is a 700, 800-year-old piece of glass purchased by George Booth and then designed into the building. Now, the pièce de résistance in the baptistry is the baptismal font itself. This was carved and designed by Leo Friedlander of New York. And Friedlander was from New York City. He had been an art student at the Art Student League and at the Beaux-Arts of Brussels. He was also an assistant to Paul Manship, and you may know Paul Manship from his sculpture at the School for Boys, the Armillary Sphere, or Paul Manship from his probably more famous work at Rockefeller Center. Now, Leo Friedlander designed all of these figures that then have these beautiful glass mosaic tiles around them. And this is all carved in Sienna marble, and they represent the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And so here you can see that the figure which really have these very beautiful Art Deco sort of elongated forms. You can see that this is Fortitude, represented by oak leaves. Next to Fortitude on the left is Counsel, which is represented by the scales or the weighing of ideas. And then you have Knowledge with its torch standing bright. And they continue with Piety with an open book. And around to Courage with flames, and so on to Justice, to Understanding and Wisdom, all of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Now, the cover over this piece is really a tour de force of gilt cloisonné. And this was designed and executed by the Edward F. Caldwell Company, which Caldwell had established his company in the late 19th century with Victor von Lossberg. And at this point, 1928, Caldwell himself had passed away, but Victor von Lossberg would lead the company into the 1930s. He would do work again at Rockefeller Center. But von Lossberg was a designer and draftsman that Caldwell knew from earlier projects. And when they started the company, von Lossberg, who was a native of Latvia and raised in Russia, he used his extensive technical skills as well as his contacts back in Europe to revive all of these sort of medieval artisan techniques. Now, the piece itself is representing all of the children of God. And so you'll see that it has the depiction of 4 races, including the indigenous person here, the Asian person here, the African, and then the Caucasian on the front. And around each of the nationalities, each of the children of God, you'll see that all of the sort of motifs and designs are reflective of these 4 geographic regions. Also around the piece are the 4 apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this whole piece actually swings back in order to get into the font. Now, this piece had quite a history before it came to Cranbrook. It was completed and then exhibited at the 1928 Architectural League show, where it won a medal. So this is one of a number of award-winning pieces of art here at Christ Church, Cranbrook. Now, up above on the ceiling, and I should mention the baptistry is a gift of Warren Scripps Booth and Alice Newcomb Booth. So each of the Booth children would give a different piece to the church. Now, the ceiling is all made of Pewabic pottery, and we've talked quite a bit about Mary Chase Perry Stratton and her Pewabic pottery. And those of you who came to my virtual tour of the Potter's House in December of last year know that she and George Booth had actually had quite a falling out over some ceramic installations at Cranbrook House, where George Booth said, "Your quote's coming in a little high, Mary. Why don't I buy some tiles from you and mix them with rookwood? That will look great." And Mary Stratton said, "Absolutely not." She actually didn't say anything. She just never talked to him again. And they had had quite a history. They were friends. They were associates. They had established the Society of Arts and Crafts together, and she just cut him off. I mean, he had so insulted her. What I think is beautiful about the Pewabic ceiling here is that it really does represent this moment of reconciliation, because George Booth, he still wasn't talking to Mary Stratton. She still hadn't forgiven him, but he told his architect, Oscar Murray, "I want you to design places for Pewabic pottery." He had seen the church, the Immaculate Conception Church in Washington, D.C., that she had done the chapel in. And so she told George Booth told his architect, "Design me a place where I can put Pewabic tiles in, and why don't you do the request to Miss Stratton?" And so Oscar Murray did, as a sort of, professional practice. This was his job. He asked Mary Stratton, "Please design the ceiling." And George Booth and her reestablished their relationship. And part of it was, he said, "Do whatever you want, and whatever it costs, I will pay." And so she had full range over her ceiling, and she decided to do these beautiful iridescent tiles. Again, probably hard to see it on Facebook Live, but head over to the center's website. Just search Christ Church Cranbrook Baptistry Kitchen Sink. That's our blog, The Kitchen Sink, and you'll see high-resolution photographs of this ceiling where you can see some of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, like wisdom represented by the beehive, understanding represented by the lamp, counsel or guidance represented by the star, fortitude with the oak tree, and piety, knowledge, and godly fear are peace represented by the dove. Now, we are next going to head along the side aisle here. And one of the things that you may have never noticed, even if you graduated here or if you have attended the church for many years, I'm sure that your children have noticed it, is that on the side aisle there are these wonderful birds. And these are actually not original to the church. These were commissioned by Oscar Murray on the advice of George Booth, or at the request of George Booth, in December of 1929. They were then carved back in Boston by Irving and Kaysen, and I'm referencing not just the birds, but the whole entire arrangement was not here on the day the church opened in 28. And so they arrived in August of 1930. They feature 2 varieties of tracery, 4 varieties of corbels, and 6 varieties of birds, including a swallow, a quail, a dove, a catbird, an owl, and an American robin, and then a 7th bird that is a little bit unidentifiable. And so why in the world would you build this church at enormous expense and not have anything on the sides? Because notice there's no windows on the side either. Well, George Booth, when he starts planning for this church around 1923, he had already watched his father-in-law give Italian religious paintings to the city of Detroit as part of the DIA. He had his own impressive collection of art, much of it in religious subject matters, and he envisioned that these side aisles would be a museum. And this is another instance where Father Marquis comes to George Booth and sort of says, great idea, love that you're building this church, love that you're paying for it all, but is a museum really what you want in a church? Do you want people coming to the church as a museum or as a sacred space? And so George Booth was convinced that he would not do a museum along the sides of his church, but that he would open another museum. And I think you know where that's going. Cranbrook Art Museum opening in 1930, the same year that these side aisles, what would have been a gallery of religious art from across European history, become these sort of side seats with the 7 birds running across, and the museum opens up across Lone Pine Road, and then would open in its current museum in 1942. Now, before we get up to the choir and the sanctuary, I want to just look at a few other things here in the nave. Again, just the technology is not helping with our women's window, but do go online or come and visit the church and really study. On our guide to the women's window, we have all of the women who are displayed, women of service, of motherhood, missionaries, saints, nuns, educators, nurses, musicians, poets, novelists, sovereigns. And the women's window was a gift of James Beresford and Florence Booth Beresford, so George and Ellen's daughter and son-in-law. And it was designed by James Hogan and made by James Powell and Sons, or the Whitefriars, which had been established again in 1680. Now, that is stained glass, and technically it is called antique glass. That doesn't refer to the age of it, but how it was made. The entirety of the east and west windows were made out of antique or handmade glass using traditional medieval methods of glass blowing. That gives it the irregular surface, it gives it the jewel tones, the beautiful color. And it's really quite different from the glass that you'll find on the side, which is Griselle glass. So this is painted glass. It's clear glass that was then hand-painted. And the reason that Oscar Murray selected the Griselle glass was that it was thought to put stained glass down the whole church would make it just too dark. And so they used this painted glass, and it allows a much more sort of powerful light to come through the entire church into the main church and sanctuary. Now, before we head up to the choir and the sanctuary, let's head over into one of 4 chapels in the church. So 2 chapels are downstairs, and then there is St. Paul's Chapel here. And there are just 3 chapels. Today, we are only going to be looking here in the main part of Christ Church Cranbrook. If you have driven by Cranbrook Road recently, you'll know that they are quite under construction, building and rebuilding the Sunday school building. And so the rest of the church is really, we're going to save it for another Live at 5. So we're not going to go downstairs today, but I do want to share with you St. Paul's Chapel. And this really lovely 60-seat chapel is centered on this quite stunning reredos by Alois Lung. And Alois Lung was a German-American woodcarver. He worked for the American Seating Company in Wisconsin, and then he worked in Grand Rapids. He designed this piece. It was carved by the William F. Ross Company of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it is infilled with paintings by Hildreth Merrier, who was a painter in New York, distinguished not necessarily for her religious art, which is quite beautiful here, but for actually her Art Deco murals. And so Hildreth Merrier her commissions ranged from medallions at Radio City Music Hall to the dome of the National Academy of Sciences in Washington to the panels of St. Paul's Chapel here at Cranbrook. She had been educated in Manhattanville, the Art Students League, and the California School of Fine Arts before she studied at the Art Institute of Chicago and then in Florence. And she once told a reporter for the Detroit News that it drives me wild to be spoken of as one of the best woman artists. Aren't I equal with men? And why is my rating always sort of marked by her gender? But it is unusual as we go about our tour today. We just are not going to see a ton of women craftsmen, but we will see two very important women painters. Now, St. Paul's Chapel is dedicated to all the workers in missions and charities, and the reredos here are divided by 3 mounts. So on the left, we see Moses on Mount Sinai. In the center, we see Calvary with the good news, with Christ and the crucifixion. And then on the right, we see Mars Hill at Athens, and where we see St. Paul preaching. And so both the paintings and the wood carvings are related to these 3 subjects. And you'll see that the paintings continue up above on the wooden board. And when there are just so many different wood craftsmen that were involved in the church, and I think that George Booth was doing that both to give more craftsmen the chance to work for his arts and crafts temple, for his arts and crafts church, but also because of the speed at which this church was built. You know, the ground is broken in 1926, and they opened in 1928. And so it was almost just too much for Irving and Kaysen to try and complete the entire church. And so we see, again, different craftsmen in the same material. Now, down below, we see that Hildreth has created different scenes of parables. And so it ranges from the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, the kingdom of heaven, on with different parables of Christ represented here in the lower panels. Now, it is St. Paul's Chapel, and so the floor is also related to St. Paul. The floor is made of different Italian marbles and Italian tiles. And we can see the temple at Diana where Paul preached. We can see his sermon about the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, one of his famous sermons. And then we can see in the corner Paul's shipwreck. And the stained glass in this room was also all related to St. Paul, and it was executed by Toland Wright of Cleveland. And so this is another example where it is truly stained glass and painted glass. It is unusual among all the glass at Christ Church Cranbrook for featuring more text. And so you can see that it says, let's see, people there, Paul here. It is really this wonderfully beautiful blue, dark, rich glass. Now, those of you who have taken enough of my tours know that for an artist studio, you always want north-facing windows because that's going to give you the most even light. I think you might want the opposite for a church where all of these beautiful north-facing windows in St. Paul's Chapel, they never really get enough light, partly because there are trees out there, partly because they get the even northern light. So, you know, you would see them better on the south, but here we are on the north end. Now, I want to next move into the choir and the sanctuary. And if you don't know a lot about religious architecture or about Gothic architecture, the choir is this sort of next space, and then the sanctuary is behind the sanctuary rail there. So as we turn the corner, we have come to the pulpit. And the pulpit features different famous preachers. And so starting on this side with John the Baptist, who is, of course, a preacher when Christ comes to him to be baptized. Then we have St. Paul, who is converted and becomes one of the of course, the author of much of the New Testament. Then we have St. Francis of Assisi, and then we have John Wesley. And John Wesley is, of course, quite a time jump from our biblical heroes, but John Wesley was the reformer of Anglicanism and also of the Methodist movement, so very important to an Anglican church like this. Now, in the pulpit, there are also other preachers, and there are these little dogs throughout the entire pulpit. And these are here because, in the words of Henry Scripps Booth, who wrote the Guide to the Church, dogs have preached great sermons on self-sacrifice and devotion. And so you'll see that there are little dogs throughout all of the beautiful tracery on the pulpit. Now, there is one other figure carved by Adam Dabrowski of New York, who was a Polish immigrant who worked in New York and later Los Angeles. And he has carved a little scribe, and many generations of Christ Church patrons have said, is the scribe taking down the important notes from the sermon? Or is the scribe falling asleep from the sermon? And the wonderful stylings of Adam Dabrowski leave us wondering if he is paying attention to the sermon, recording it all down, or snoozing. Now, as we head up here, let's start with the ceiling. Now, the ceiling, you may notice, is all wood. It's all resting on the stone construction of the church. And this is all decorated by Alfred E. Flogel. And Flogel was, as his name implies, a German immigrant. He paints around the frieze 3 scriptures from Isaiah, 1 Corinthians, and Ephesians. And Flogel then also comes in and he does all of the stunning painting on the organ doors. And the organ doors were meant to open and close, but they actually do quite a bit of damage to the organ, because if you think about it, you tune an organ by moving the pipes in and out of their organ box. And so if you're jostling the entire thing with these giant doors on a machine, you're going to get the organ out of tune. So to my knowledge, it's very rarely, if ever, opened or closed, but we have these beautiful doors that were a gift from James Scripps and Jean McLaughlin Booth. So James Scripps Booth and his wife, his first wife, gave these doors. Now, the doors feature the sort of singing choir of angels, as well as the scripture, "Sing forth the glory of his name, then shall the trees of the wood sing for joy." And you can almost see the organ pipes being the sort of trees here that the angels are singing about. Now, we heard the organ at the beginning of our tour. It's a 4-manual and pedal organ built by the Skinner Company, and it's been rebuilt and tweaked throughout its history. And I'll talk about why the organ has never quite worked as everyone intended in just a moment, because there's a pretty significant change to the church that comes about. Now, this little mullion, which leads into the library, is part of the construction on the church. The library we won't be going through on the tour, but these beautiful windows by, again, the G. Owen Bonowitz studio are surrounding a little mullion with a lovely 12th century depiction of Saint Agricola, the Bishop of Avignon, who lived around 700. And this is, in fact, a 12th century French ecclesiastical pillar. So this is another piece of spolia, or a work of art or architecture that's taken from one spot and built into another. And so that is one of the older items here at the church. Now, there is also here the beautiful lectern, and the lectern features more English theologians and English poets. And so they are down here, and, oh, nope, they're actually even further down. I don't know which one is which, but we have Cadman, the earliest English Christian poet. That looks like that might be Cadman. Then we have John Wycliffe, the reformer and translator of the Bible, and on the back is William Tyndale, the martyr who translated the New Testament into English. And so those are on the lectern where the scripture is then read. As we come up into the choir stalls, we can see that on the choir stalls are the little choir boys who are busy singing. And Matt Horn, who you saw earlier, pressed the magical button that told the organ to start. That is how a bride knows, or when the bride is ready to walk down the aisle, there's essentially a doorbell that lights up a light at the organ. Matt is also a employee of the center. He's one of our guides, but he's also singing in the choir. And I've seen him on this side, and I don't know if he is rubbing that guy's forehead down, but they're supposed to be youths of the choir. I feel like the rubbing down of all of our little choristers is making them look a little bit older. Now, there are also the back row of the choir loft, which they look like standard seats, but they in fact flip up and become misericords. And misericords come from the Latin misericordia, which means mercy or compassion, and cor, misery, to have pity, and cor, heart. And so they are meant to allow elder monks lean on these. So in the 13th century, when you had to stand up for the entire church service, for the entire choir, if you're an older monk, then you can begin using a misericord, and you sort of stay standing but can lean back. And so the seats all flip up and reveal the misericord underneath them. Now, these were designed by the architect with George Booth. And they feature on the north side the 7 deadly sins, and then on the south side they feature sins, but also other scenes. And so here we can see machinery in this almost the equivalent of the Diego Rivera murals down at the DIA, where you have this sort of scene of Detroit industrial life being carved underneath the seat. And misericords traditionally are quite, they can be humorous, they can even be slightly offensive. Ours tend to be more charming than anything else, but I love that this one, which is charlatanism in art, is quite possibly the only opinion that George Booth ever expressed about modernism in art. And so you have this artist who's carving almost this sort of cubist sculpture, and I mean, it is a sort of representational of modern art of this period, 1928, 1929, and yet George Booth titles it charlatanism in art. So he is this sort of fraudulent quack of an artist making non-representational sculpture. It's the only time that we really get George Booth expressing an opinion on modern art, other than sort of looking at his house and saying, there is no modern art in George Booth's house. Meanwhile, he's founding one of the great modern art schools in the country. Now, speaking of George Booth, we have come to our one and only depiction of the donor of this building in the church. You'll notice this is not the George Booth Episcopal Church. It's not the George Booth organ, and even the 5 Booth children, who all gave really quite substantial gifts to the church. None of their names are written on any of their gifts. It was really meant to be a selfless act of Christian charity to build this church. And so our one representation of George Booth comes in this very funny misericord, where you have on one side the architect, Oscar Murray, and on the other side you have George Booth. And that's because very late in construction, the foundations of the church had already been laid. Construction was moving abreast when Dr. Marquis sort of goes to George Booth and he says, we've designed a 600-person church, but I've been looking at the blueprints, and where are 600 people sitting? That includes 60 people in St. Paul's. It includes 50 members in the choir. It includes the leadership sitting up. You know, it will be 600 people, but it won't be 600 pilgrims. It won't be 600 worshipers. I think we need to make the church bigger. And so George Booth becomes quite panicked. And sort of overnight, he sends not only a letter to Oscar Murray, but he also sends a telegram to Oscar Murray saying, can we make the church bigger? Can we make the church bigger? I want to add another bay. And Oscar Murray writes back and says, I've been thinking the same thing. let's not add one, let's add two. And so the Misericord commemorates this pretty late addition as they take the design of Christ Church Cranbrook and they rip it apart in order to add in two new bays and to make the church really substantially bigger. So if we stand up and look, I mean, it's these two bays that are slipped into the church. At that same time, the entrance to the church changes. So it was going to be, a parish, a country church, and the door would have actually been coming from the south, and then you would turn into the church. It becomes a center axis, much more along the lines of a grand cathedral. And the organ had already been designed. The organ had already been installed. And that is why, and I can attest as someone who has snuck into services late, it is very hard to hear the organ in the back of this church because acoustically the church was designed to be two bays smaller. And there are modern sort of speakers and things that do help with getting the sort of sound back there. But I think Oscar Murray in his writing to George Booth where he says, oh, it's going to be fine. It's going to be very intimate. It will make it more dramatic. That's all true. But what he wasn't telling George Booth was the idea of the sermon actually reaching there in the dimensions that I've designed. You are going to have a very narrow church that's going to be very acoustically challenging. Of course, all of you who have attended a Cranbrook graduation and are standing, all of you who come to a Christmas service and are stuck on the sides behind a column, know that even with the acoustical challenges, Christ Church Cranbrook was built in the middle of farmland for a growing community, and that community has grown. The church is much bigger than it ever was imagined by George and Ellen, and the church is, I'm sure, very grateful to have that expansion built in at the time of construction and not trying to work out a bigger church now. Now, the floor of the choir here is a mixture of slate, Casota limestone, which is the exact same limestone that Kingswood would be built out of. It's also the same limestone that Cranbrook Art Museum would be built out of. So you have the slate, you have the Casota stone, and then you have the beautiful mixture of Pewabic pottery tiles. And so some are what really is the sort of bread and butter of Pewabic pottery, which are these very simple, very humble, handmade clay tiles. And then there is what we Detroiters obsess over, which are the iridescent Pewabic pottery tiles, the glazes that took Mary Stratton 10 years to research and figure out how she could actually make these iridescent tiles and to get these metallic finishes using different oxides and metals and low firing techniques. All of this research she put into in order to figure out how to get this beautiful shimmering iridescent design. And these tiles are pretty darn exquisite as you walk up to the sanctuary and the sanctuary rail. Now, as we get to the sanctuary, we are arriving at a few more objects and more treasures here, including this 15th century bishop's chair that was purchased as an antique. And so this is where the bishop sits if he's present, not the rector sits here. And so you have a beautiful 15th century rector's chair surrounded by other furniture from the company of master craftsmen. So antiques as well as new pieces. And then there is the Reredo by John Kirschmeyer. Now, Kirschmeyer is a name that those of you who have followed along with Live at Fives long enough, or if you've been to a tour of Cranbrook, you know that we love Johannes Kirschmeyer, or John Kirschmeyer, the German-American woodcarver born in Obergemmerau, practicing in Boston from the age of 20. And he actually was one of the woodcarvers working for Irving and Kaysen. So at this point, he is off on his own, but he is doing the sort of monumental center of the church on his own, while his former company, his former firm, is doing the rest of the wood carving in the church. Now, in the center of it is Zechariah holding the Christ figure, and Mary on the left and Joseph on the right. And then there is this beautiful Vessus Pisces, this pointed pointed oval, pointed shape, two intersecting arcs, which is a prominent form in early Christian art. And then it's used here. And interestingly, the next time you come into the Cranbrook Woodward Avenue entrance, that's the only other time that I've seen the word Vessus Pisces used to describe a shape. And the guard booth into Cranbrook's campus is also in the form of a Vessus Pisces. Now, it is a little hard to see this on Facebook Live, so I won't get into too many of the details of the wood carving, but instead I'll come down and I'll focus here on these magnificent candlesticks created by the German-American ironsmith Frank Korolowski. And Frank Korolowski did the ironwork at Cranbrook House's library. He did some of the locks and doors at Cranbrook House. And I really think that his masterpieces here in Cranbrook are these candlesticks. Now, there's quite an impressive display of his up at the Art Institute of Chicago. So if you're in Chicago, get there to the American Wing and see some more of one of America's great ironsmiths. And we are seeing here sort of this narrative running around the base of the candlestick. And we have joy on one side and sorrow on the other side. And so you'll see that they appear quite symmetrical when you first look at them, and then in the individual details, they are different, and they tell different stories by candlesticks. And then in the center, one of my favorite pieces, I'm grateful to Christopher for bringing this out for us today, is the monumental cross made at Cranbrook in the Arts and Crafts Studios by Arthur Neville Kirk. And Arthur Neville Kirk was an English silversmith practicing in London when George Booth, after failing to get George Jensen to immigrate from Denmark to Bloomfield Hills, convinces Arthur Neville Kirk to come and start to be the sort of personal silversmith to the Cranbrook Arts and Crafts Studios. Now, Arthur Neville Kirk was involved in the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts, and he started the metalsmithing program that's now at CCS. And then he came to Cranbrook and he started the metalsmithing program at Cranbrook Academy of Art. And we do have multiple pieces of Kirk's work at Cranbrook, but this is his masterpiece of the Cranbrook years. So this is made in the Arts and Crafts Studios over by Sarnen House and on display here for services and used here at services at Christ Church. You see the apostles and you see this beautiful turquoise is all molten glass. So it's all cloisonné that has been dripped into the chased and hammered silver of the cross. And it's the four apostles there. Now, we are coming to the end of our tour, but those of you who read the blog know that we talked about the needlework on the blog last Friday. This is a little bit later, the needlework from 1977 to 1980 done for the front of the church. And then we cannot have a tour of the church without talking about probably the most impressive part of the church, which are the frescoes by Catherine McEwen. Now, Catherine Sibley McEwen was an English-born American artist. Her family was from Detroit. They were living in London. She grows up between Detroit, Canada, and England. She comes to work for George Booth first at the Cranbrook Cottage in about 1912. She does work for Brookside for the Meeting House in 1918. That was last week's Live at 5. She does work for Eliel Saarinen a little bit after this. But here is her sort of magnum opus, 1925 to 1928, and it is the sort of story of a world built on Christianity. And there is a really amazing guide that takes us through all of the known figures. Today, maybe that will be a future Live at 5, if the church will have me. We'll do a closer study of the Catherine McEwen murals, but they are true frescoes, Italian for fresh. And so McEwen was painting these, and what she would do is she would put a thin skim of wet plaster, and then she would use pigment, unmixed pigment, and she would begin adding pigment into the wet plaster. And the lime and the plaster and the pigment will absorb, and it has a chemical reaction, and so the wall itself is the painting. This is not painted on the surface, it is the wall itself. It's a very ancient technique. It's most famous for the Renaissance frescoes of Michelangelo in the Vatican and throughout Italy. And here are some of the largest true frescoes ever executed in America. Now, on the left, we see various missionaries. So we see the four apostles. I think this is Luke and John. I'm not sure who we have here. So they have the halos. And then we're going to see a collection of Christian missionaries. So on the left, you see the Spanish padre. Then you see missionaries witnessing to the American indigenous people. And then you see contemporary to the 1920s, Episcopal missionaries witnessing to the American, to the citizens of the Philippines. And so you have this sort of everyone from the Spanish padre to the American colonists to then the Episcopal bishops headed to the Philippines. Next up, you're going to see some of the modern missionaries witnessing to the unhoused, to homeless populations. And then I think one of my most favorite parts are the children who are being pulled out of the factories. And so there is this idea that, again, the church can help bring children out of child labor and out of the factory. As you move up, you move from the earthly world into the heavenly world, and you end up with all of the angels up above. Now, on the right-hand side, it's not the story of missions, but it's various Christian ministers and preachers. And you'll see that we go again from our remaining two Gospels to somewhere over here is a sissy ministering to the animals. Oh, here he is. So here's St. Francis of Assisi, who's ministering to the birds and animals, which I quite love. And then the best part of the mural, in my opinion, as your resident architecture historian and art historian, is not St. Jerome and his lion, but here do you see there is a scribe, a scholar with his two young pupils, and then there is an architect who has his church there in the middle, and then below that is an artist. And notice of all the people in this whole fresco, all of the humans, all the figures of the earth are all looking down, except for two people are looking up. And that is the artist, who is painting the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and the hermit, the sort of, and so these two figures are the only two who are not looking back at the earth, but who are looking up at the heavens. And so Catherine McEwen has created her masterpiece, this fresco, going up into the four horsemen and the stories from Revelation, and she has sort of added the artist as this inspired person who can help us see religion and can use art to further the faith, to further the sort of Christian gospel. And then on this side, one of George Booth's favorite motifs, St. George and the Dragon, of course. If you've toured with me through Cranbrook House, you know that there's St. George and the Dragon everywhere around Cranbrook House. So there's just a couple of more things that I wanted to show us on our tour, and the church really has infinite amount of art and infinite amount of stories, and I haven't even touched on really the critical mission of why George Booth and Ellen Booth paid for all this, why they built a church, which is to witness to the community, to be of service to the community. And so I encourage you, if you're interested in the church, to acquire the 50th anniversary history of Christ Church, Christ Church of History, or to visit the church or its website, to come in and meet people at the church, because they really have done this church has quite a 91-year legacy of work in the community, serving not only Cranbrook's community and involved in all of the founding of our institutions, but involved in really Detroit and this wider metropolitan Detroit community from its opening in 1928, even before that, up into today. So it is a living, breathing, working church, serving this community and serving the mission of this community. It's much more than all of this art and glory. I found it very interesting to look at the dedicatory sermon about the church, though, where the bishop really was making a very compelling argument that the beauty of this church, the beauty of our religious spaces, are a way of witnessing, of bringing ourselves closer to God, and of bringing ourselves into a sort of using beauty to bring ourselves into a more meditative space. And I do think that's what all the art and craft achieves. Now, before I get to here, this door reminds me, I did forget to mention another gift from Henry Scripps-Booth and Carolyn Farr-Booth, which is the east window done by a Philadelphia stained glass artist, Nicola del Acinzo, who was born in Italy, trained in Philadelphia, and it has this wonderful blue color that is pretty unique of all the windows. It's hard to see on camera, but if we compare the Griselle of Bonnewitt, the painted glass of Bonnewitt, to then the Christ window, the blues, the artist here had spent time at Chartres Cathedral, and he actually convinced Chartres Cathedral to allow him to go up onto scaffolding and to study all the colors of Chartres Cathedral. And he did that in 1924, and he comes back and he does this window, finished in 1928, and it is the story of Christ in 12 panels, from the Nativity at the top left to the Ascension at the lower right. And our little stained glass artist is now seen somewhere on this panel. And so this door, which is carved by Kirschmeyer, is the Doubting Thomas door. And you can see here that Thomas is seeing Christ. He's seeing the wound of Christ. He is no longer doubting. But up at the top of the Doubting Thomas door, perhaps slightly unrelated to Doubting Thomas, are these amazing little carvings of our artisans. And so here is the ironworker, Frank Korlowski, who did those beautiful candlesticks and did other metalwork here in the church and at Cranbrook. Next is the stained glass artist. You can see he has the panel of the stained glass here. Next is the architect, Oscar Murray of Bertram Goodhue Associates. Two little monks. Now, this one, Henry Booth says that the potter Johannes Kirschmeyer refused to carve a woman. I don't know, that's not true. He carved a woman in the Cranbrook House overmantel. So this is either just a different potter, or Henry Booth speculated that it was Buck Stratton, that it was Mr. Mary Chase Perry Stratton, Pewabic Pottery founder's husband. I'm not quite sure about that one. Then the painter is our German friend who does the ceiling. And then here is a portrait of Johannes Kirschmeyer. And you can see that he has his wooden carving tools and his iconic hair that so defines every portrait of Kirschmeyer that he carved on campus. And I love this door because as you look at the door, it sort of disintegrates and becomes this very simple wooden panel. And that is an architectural move that Bertram Goodhue, whose firm builds this church, it's a development that he brings to Gothic design, the idea of the sort of richly ornamented top disintegrating into just pure material. It's a very 20th century design move that we can see here, Kirschmeyer bringing from Goodhue's architecture into the wooden door. And then a lovely painting of Saint Lucia, the patron saint of the blind, by Zaganelli da Cotignola, the Italian Renaissance artist. So this has been quite a whirlwind tour of Christ Church Cranbrook. I know that I missed things. I certainly know I mispronounced things. And I do hope that all of you have enjoyed this glimpse into a corner of campus that has been so special to so many people at Cranbrook. Whether this is where you got married, whether it's where you were baptized or had a funeral here, or whether you graduated from the Academy of Art or from one of our Cranbrook schools here in this room. Though the church since 1973 has not been part of Cranbrook educational community, it is a really vital part of our community's past and even our present. Thanks so much for joining us for this tour. I do want to thank the church again for letting me into the building. This was quite a long wait, but I understand all the different protocols and things that we've been doing, and the church has, throughout this COVID pandemic, has not stopped services, and it's not stopped its mission to the community. And so I know that this Live at 5 was a long time coming. So many of you have requested it. It was my pleasure to do it. I do want to thank Father Bill Donaher, the current rector of the church, for allowing me in, as well as the sexton for helping to prepare it, as well as Matt Horn of the church choir and the Center for Collections and Research for helping me turn on and turn off the lights, and of course Christopher Wells for the wonderful organ introduction. I also want to thank Jill at the church for working with me to set up a time that I could be here. Now, we are going to be back with another Live at 5 next Wednesday. I hope that now that we've done our first tour of Christ Church Cranbrook, we can come back and do some more, because there's so much more to see in the Guildhall, in St. Dunstan's Chapel. It really is this monument to the arts and crafts. And I mentioned that at the beginning of the tour, and I'll elaborate it just a minute here at the end, which is, the arts and crafts movement was essentially a rejection of the Industrial Revolution, and it celebrated hand craftsmanship, it celebrated tradition. In architecture and art, it's called the arts and crafts. In painting, it's called the Pre-Raphaelite movement. And it flourishes in England in the 1880s and 1890s. It flourishes in America by the 1900s. But by 1928, when this church is consecrated, there's really a limited sort of people who are advocating for the arts and crafts movement, and one of those is George Booth. And so this church really stands as quite a powerful punctuation mark at the end of this movement, because what would happen after 1928? Well, you get the Art Deco, you get modernism, you get sort of Eliel Saarinen's churches. I mean, think of First Christian Church in Columbus, Indiana. Imagine Cranbrook Art Museum as a church, and that's just 12 years later than this. And so it's really through the dedication, through the $16.5 million of George and Ellen Booth, and really through George's deep, deep belief in both Christian philanthropy, Christian ministry, and in the value of art and craft, of stonemasons, woodcarvers, glassmakers, silversmiths, ironsmiths. It's really George Booth's belief in the value of creating beautiful things for the glory of God, for the education of mankind, that we have this church at all. And it really is a remarkable thing that George and Ellen gave outright to the community. They did not allow the Episcopal Diocese to pay for anything, and nothing is donated other than the Booth family. So really quite a legacy that the church has here, and that we at Cranbrook are grateful to as this sort of start of the entire Cranbrook educational community. Of course, George Booth was 62 when he started this project, and he easily could have gone into retirement at Cranbrook House and been like so many other wealthy people and left his house to his children, left his fortune to his children. But by the time he's envisioning this church in 1923, he is sitting at Cranbrook House with his family. They have the little meeting house. They have the Greek theater. By the time this church is consecrated in September of 1928, the ball is rolling on the creation of Cranbrook School for Boys, Kingswood School for Girls, Cranbrook Academy of Art, Cranbrook Institute of Science, and the Art Museum. By the time that he is doing this, he has transformed his little private estate into the Cranbrook that we know and love. It's a pretty remarkable journey, and it really all goes back to the artisans, the church leaders, and all of the people who worked with George Booth to conceive of and create this masterpiece of the Gothic architecture here in Southeast Michigan. Thanks so much for joining us for another Live at 5. This was a fun one to do. It was a little bit like going back in time in the pandemic to when I tried to do far too ambitious of tours in just a limited amount of time, but I really wanted to give you a good sense of the church. head back to the church for a service, come back for a tour with one of the amazing Christchurch Cranbrook docents. I recommend Janice King, who's on our center board and who gives remarkable tours of the church, or head over to Cranbrook Archives or ask the church for a copy of The Pilgrim's Guide to Christchurch Cranbrook. That's what I used for so much of my information today, and it goes art object by art object. Best of luck to Christchurch as they continue construction on their new Sunday school wing, and I will see all of you next Wednesday for another Live at 5.